Oh boy, this is gonna be tough. Now I want to start off by saying that Avowed is not a bad game, despite there being a lot of people kind of nitpicking both on trying to make the game look better than it is and making the game seem worse than it is over here on the internet. It is not bad, and there are a lot of elements of Avowed that are very good, and I think that a lot of people that jump into the game with their expectations in check are going to have a really good time with it. The problem is that if your expectations towards the game are anything like, oh, it's an Obsidian RPG, or it's the smaller scale attempt to compete with something like Skyrim, you're going to walk away very disappointed. And this is going to be a general theme throughout this video. It really depends on how you view it. Some people will say that Avowed had a very clear vision of what it wanted to do and what it wanted to get right, and it ignores everything else. Anything even remotely concerning the word immersion was not a factor here. And a lot of other people are going to say that Avowed is a game that just doesn't feel like it's from this decade in its overall world interaction and how a lot of its story beats go, that it is subpar compared to Obsidian's other games, and they would be very right in those specific critiques. But just the same, you could look at Avowed as a game that takes some very interesting steps forward for this genre, steps that other genres have made in the past to modernize a lot of the general moving and attacking and just having good combat loops. Or you could look at that same situation and say that Avowed is a pretty decent action game and a pretty bad RPG. And there's a lot to kind of balance and cover there, because it's a hard thing to review a game that isn't just outright bad, it's just kind of disappointing and frustrating in certain aspects, but also shines in a lot of other aspects. And I think there's a very interesting conversation to have around Avowed, and especially around the kind of identity crisis that the game seems to have a lot of the time. So look, for my reviews, I like to get things out of the way very quickly. I received Avowed courtesy of Xbox. And if you're wondering if it's worth your time and your money, here's the simple thing that you should consider. If you're looking for a game that is going to feel kind of like a single-player MMORPG, a very dead world with very obvious quest givers, where you go, take on quests, explore different zones, and you mostly engage in combat, exploration, and a bit of puzzles. You could even kind of make a comparison to something like Borderlands in the overall structure, honestly. And if that's what you're looking for, just action and exploration and kind of not anything cool in terms of story and dialogue and stuff like that, you're gonna have a great time with Avowed. Now, if you're looking for anything remotely in the land of a very in-depth RPG, in-depth systems, more of the immersive sim type stuff, something to really engross you with its story, its characters, and be compelling in your reasons to continue and finding out what is going to happen next, I don't think you're gonna have a good time with Avowed unless you heavily change your expectations before going into it. So before we go very deep into the good and bad in Avowed, hi, I'm Mug, and if you're new here, welcome. If you're not new here, welcome back. Remember to like the video. If you like the video, that helps the channel, helps it grow, and hopefully this is a video that's going to put into words a lot of the very polarized opinions that there are about Avowed. So look, Avowed might be a game that has a lot of problems, but you know what doesn't have problems? Today's sponsor, Boot.dev. And that's because Boot.dev is your online learning platform for back-end web development. And they want to get you actually ready for a real job in the industry, which by the way, they pay pretty well. And you'll learn the basics for Python and Go to get you coding as quick as possible while having fun. And that's the most important part of learning, because Boot.dev accomplishes their learning objective with gamification. The entire course is interactive. You earn badges, achievements, and even compete on leaderboards with other members. They have an active community over on Discord where people chat and talk about the different things that they've learned. And they do everything possible to present the world of coding in the most exciting way possible, which I hear from viewers of the channel is actually true, but I will never believe it because I look at code and I'm just confused. But you don't have to be. And you can go see for yourself using the link in the description below, because Boot.dev is open and free to use as a huge textbook with all of the information you might need. But if you want to start participating in the community, get those gamification elements, and actually run the course, you will sign up for a subscription, which if that sounds fun to you, you can use the code MUGTHIEF to get 25% off your first purchase. Doesn't matter if that's a 1-month subscription or 1 year. Overall, Boot.dev is a brilliant project because what they care about is making the learning experience fun, which is something that I can totally get on board with. And they're the oldest sponsor on the channel because you guys have found that to be true as well. Use the link in the description below to check them out, and thanks to them for continuing to support the channel. So here is the main problem. Avowed is a game with an identity crisis. There's a couple of ways of looking at what this game even is. You could view it as an RPG continuation of the world of Aora, the world established in Pillars of Eternity, but that honestly abandons a lot of the great world building from those games, while still trying to shove all of the lore and world building down your throat in optional books, its encyclopedia features, and what feels like a different, more interesting game from a story perspective hiding underneath all of it. Viewed this way, it's not very good. But you could also view it in a much more favorable light. It's a game that takes the first-person, slightly immersive sim style of RPGs like Oblivion or Fallout 3, or the most apt comparison, The Outer Worlds, and then focuses all of its efforts exclusively on creating a movement and combat system that is truly, actually good. Look, I don't mean to ruffle feathers, but most of those games, the recently coined Scrolls-like genre, doesn't have very good combat. That's because even though combat could be a very big part of them, it was never the most important nor the only part. It was always more about building your character and finding different unique ways of completing your goals. Sure, when all of that fails, you kind of default back to combat, but for many builds that was the last resort compared to stealth or dialogue or just straight up creativity and exploration, whatever you wanted to do. A very different and specific feeling regarding combat compared to other games that have that more to their center, even things like on the CRPG side of the equation. Games like Baldur's Gate 3, where the combat is a very big part of the game, but it's also akin to a tabletop experience of endless creativity and very well-defined builds and strategy. This subgenre of RPGs has always had pretty mediocre combat, and honestly, some pretty clunky movement and overall methods of engaging with the world overall. And if you agree with any of that, congratulations, Avowed mostly fixes it. It adds a combat system that maybe not quite, but almost can practically carry an entire game on its back. It feels really good and fun to move around, and it can be very pretty, and it enhances the experience of exploring an open world and navigating it compared to most games like it, including The Outer Worlds. So this is the way it's going to work. I am not even going to talk about the story until we get to the negative section of this video. Instead, I'm going to talk about the 3 main positives that Avowed has and a lot of the mistakes that it still makes within those positives. And those are mainly combat, movement, and exploration. And here's the thing, combat in Avowed can be pretty fun. It knows that it's at the core of the game, as I said before, and therefore it worries a lot less about having a sandbox of options and instead says, hey, we need combat, so we have to make combat better than it usually is. At the heart of the combat system is a very familiar feeling stamina bar for attacking, evading, and blocking, and another extra resource, essence, which is spent on magic as well as your abilities. There is a bit of a Doom 2016 vibe of momentum in the combat because defeated enemies refill your essence a bit, kind of continuing to fuel your abilities or magic, and you can equip 2 different loadouts. Normally, that's going to be probably a one-handed weapon and then a book or a shield, and then a two-handed weapon or another combo of 2 one-handed weapons. I would recommend a book in every single case because the magic system in the game is one of the highlights of it. And the overall feel of combat is really solid, much more so than many other games in its style. It felt a lot closer to something like Tainted Grail, which is a game I've praised in the past for feeling a lot better in its combat and overall feedback than games like Oblivion or Skyrim. The game features combos, heavy strikes, dashes, blocks, parries, and a whole host of different abilities that you can unlock and equip and use on a ton of different weapon styles. And the biggest focus that the game has is on gear progression, which does include quite a bit of build craft. Pretty much everything you find out in the world are weapons that you want to break down into their materials because you want to be focusing on unique gear, which is considerably stronger and comes with different passive benefits, and in the case of weapons you can even upgrade them through a very small two-choice tree to specialize that weapon further. When you combine that with the different passives of your armor and your accessories and then what you spec'd into in your actual build, you do have a bit of flexibility and a lot of fantasy fulfillment within the restraints of the game. At one point in my playthrough, I had mostly maxed out using wands, which are the faster ranged option, and I spec'd into having my unique electric wand bounce every heavy attack to other enemies, inflicting shock to all of them. And I combined that with slinging some extra spells like Blizzard and Lifesteal Rays, and I also spec'd into a bit of medium armor and was using a huge two-handed sword as my secondary weapon. And I would use that for my one-on-ones or bosses since it caused bleed and was very good at staggering them, which leads to an immediate critical attack. By the end of Avowed, I was running heavy armor that had me regenerate essence and a mace that allowed me to regenerate HP, while also wielding a bow that manipulated time to slow down my opponents, with a little bit of spellcasting including another spirit bow for good measure and extra damage. And that was really good. Now, there's a whole host of problems that come with the endgame, because it turns out that when Avowed actually wants to be just a full-on action game and drops every pretense of an RPG, it comes into a lot of other problems, and the endgame, which is mostly a combat gauntlet, is one of the worst parts of the game, honestly, but we'll get into that in the minor spoiler section later on. But let's focus on when the game is firing on all cylinders, when everything is nice and balanced and you've got your build online. In these moments, the fantasy fulfillment of my chosen role as an envoy, in this case a spell-slinging badass with a giant sword on his back, was fulfilled, and it was real fun to do. Some of the absolute chaos that you can end up cooking up are things like this shield build that I ran for a while, where all I did was put a bunch of different reflecting damage shields on myself, and then stand still, regenerating mana by attacking people with a staff, or sucking people's souls to keep myself healthy while receiving all of that extra mitigated damage from people to reflect at them. And this was viable. I could just kind of stand there and the enemies would end up just taking care of themselves. Looks absolutely hideous, an absolute mess, don't know what's going on half the time, but the game let me do it. The game very clearly wants you to build or at least use multiple things, especially magic, since all you really need for that are books and a small investment into the wizard tree, and then you can cast any spell from that book, no matter how many points you have into the specific spells, or you can invest points into those spells to use them without a book. So that hot swapping between melee weapons and throwing out a spell and pulling out a gun, that stuff is really well done. And it's all bolstered by the equally fun movement. Sometimes that is combat, where more melee-oriented skills and the general feedback of dodging or sliding under enemies and things like that can be very good, but more importantly, in exploration and how the overall world is built. The game features 4 decently sized open world areas very similar to The Outer Worlds, and it allows you to quickly mantle up ledges and find creative paths around things with jumping puzzles or sliding under stuff and crawling through caves, and it just feels way better than the more rigid and robotic feeling movement that you've come to expect in other games like it. A lot of the level design in the game, which is one of the biggest highlights of it, is very vertical, and that verticality matters as you look throughout the environment, find tucked away hidden puzzles or loot, and even in combat where that positioning and taking advantage of it can help you win fights against enemies that are a bit stronger than you. This means that the most important parts of Avowed are all present in these 3 elements, and that is where the gameplay loop of Avowed shows up. In this game, you create a character, you arrive in the living lands, you talk to people, you pick up quests, and then you explore an open area by running around it, fighting stuff, looking around, trying to spot different caves or secret passages and stuff like that. You go into them, you fight stuff, you get cool loot, you get materials to upgrade your loot, you head back to town, you turn in quests, and then you do that again for 3 more zones. Roll credits. If you think what I just said sounds and looks fun, especially if you think that the whole idea of just walking around a world, encountering stuff and finding things is interesting, then you're gonna have a lot of fun with Avowed, and that is one of the parts of these sorts of games that I appreciate the most. The overall feeling of exploring an area and finding cool things in it. This is one of the games that I've found with some of the best looking vistas, interesting nooks and crannies, and very cool surprises hidden in pretty much every corner. But this is where the problems come in. And the first and biggest problem is actually in combat. I tested the game quite thoroughly on both normal and hard difficulty settings, and in both cases I bumped into some very big problems regarding pacing and balance, and that's because gear in Avowed is divided into 5 tiers, and they range from basic to legendary, with 3 smaller tiers in each of those 5. The most important part of all of this is jumping from a whole tier to another. Enemies in the game follow the same leveling structure, with them divided between those tiers, and if an enemy is just a tier above your gear, they hit way harder and take a lot less damage. This is because there is a flat passive obtained upon reaching each gear level, so the instant you get some gear that is the same tier as your enemy, you deal way more damage, and that magically turns what was somewhere between difficult, frustrating, or impossible into something that is often just way too easy. This overall pacing means that there's moments in the game where you will feel forced to either go and find gear at the level that you theoretically should be for the area you want to go into, and then respec into whatever that gear you found is, which isn't a big deal because that is very cheap and easy to do, or you can spend some time exploring and find items so you can upgrade your current gear, the one that you probably like and have already spec'd into, and get that to the next tier. This is where some of that Borderlands comparison from before comes in, because a lot of Avowed is fighting, and a lot of fighting is gear and abilities, and it comes with these big spikes of difficulty. This means you have to play by the game's rules a lot of the time, without there really being an organic pace to upgrading your equipment unless you are playing the game and spending a healthy amount of time exploring. And look, that exploration can be a ton of fun, so I can't complain about that. But there is still a lot of friction, and it's very easy to find yourself in a situation where you feel trapped. You don't have enough materials to upgrade your current gear, and you're not strong enough to go fight and find new, better gear. And given how limited some of the upgrade resources can be, and because there's no refund system for them, the game turns this into a kind of anxiety-inducing feeling where upgrading the wrong thing means you spent resources you won't get back into something that now you can't use. At that point, I guess you would have to try and grind out some of the materials and find other ways than the normal ones of getting some of those upgrade materials, and that sounds terrible. This is where the identity crisis really starts to show, because the fact that the game gives you the ability to respec pretty easily and at a very low cost, and the fact that the game gives you the 2 loadout system that has you switching between weapons all the time, those to me clearly communicate, hey, we want our players to experiment, to play around, to have fun with this combat system that we built. Dabble into different trees, experiment with different weapon combinations, go crazy. But then the gear progression is incredibly restrictive, and it basically punishes you if you start investing too much into too many things and rewards you for going all in on one thing. The only other way to kind of compensate for the gear checks and just how big that wall of damage becomes is by just fully investing into one thing. Pick out the highest level weapon you have and then invest all of your ability points into the passives for that weapon style. And that, since it's mostly percentage-based buffs, will probably put you on equal footing with your enemies for a while until you can get that. But that just runs entirely counter to the whole having fun with experimenting thing. The final result is a progression system that, instead of feeling smooth and flexible, feels disjointed and frustrating unless you happen to play by the game's unwritten rules. This is why I'm pretty sure that some people that just go all in and decide what they want to do right off the bat might not ever encounter these issues. But it's still a problem because there's so much about this game's design that is focused on you experimenting and having fun. It seems to have giant arrows everywhere telling you to go do that. The biggest problem, and one that I think is going to be very common, is that you can find yourself just above what your enemies are doing or just below, and it's very rare for you to be at the perfect level of challenge. I think I was there maybe 2 or 3 times, and when I was, I had a blast playing in those battles. But the majority of my playtime, the enemies were above me, which led to drawn-out fights where I was just waiting for my cooldowns or just waiting for my stamina to recover and just killing stuff, and everything just felt like it took way too long, or things were too easy and I would just walk in, throw a heavy attack, have it bounce around, and everything was dead. And when the combat is either too easy or way too slow, the amount of combat in this game becomes boring very quickly. Now, from a design perspective, it's very difficult to come up with a good solution to this problem. I am a huge fan of having your enemies not scale with the player, and hammering home that feeling of progression as you get stronger and stronger. But I do think there is a slightly better solution to the problem here, which is making sure that once you are in the next zone, you should be receiving just excessive amounts of materials for the previous tier of weapons, so that you can have a slightly underpowered arsenal, but with a ton of different stuff upgraded. That way, you can test stuff out very close to the power level it should be before committing the more rare resources into bumping them up. As it stands, that is not the case, by the way. You will not have enough to upgrade multiple different loadouts from the start of the game all the way until the end game. Now, aside from this, I'm sure people could nitpick more stuff about the combat, but I honestly found it to be pretty good most of the time, except when it started to drag on, and very similar to a game like the Veilguard, but to a much lesser extent. The more I played of the game, the more I kind of got tired of that combat loop. It just doesn't sustain for as long as it needs to in that final progression tier, especially as some of the fights just become longer and longer because the enemies just have more and more health. But I generally found the variety of enemies to be more than sufficient. I had quite a lot of fun with different combinations of enemies. There's a healthy amount of unique enemies to fight around the world, including the bounty quests that are scattered around each zone, and those kind of also serve to naturally guide you towards exploration and finding different locations in that world to find secrets that are sometimes really strong items or passive benefits. And I mention those positives because they're there, not to underplay just how severely jank the pacing can become at different points in the game, and how that slows that pacing to a crawl of absolute frustration. But these are the negatives of what's good in the game, so get ready for the negatives of what I didn't like. And that's because Avowed, for me, has one of the weakest stories I've played in an RPG possibly ever. The only truly interesting elements of this story are the living lands themselves, which is a big point of the overall story, as your character is both an envoy of Adir, the hostile nation looking to take over these mysterious lands, but also a godlike, and you have a special connection to a god, which, very minor spoiler, you finally figure out what god you quote-unquote belong to on your expedition to the living lands. The only character I found engaging was the childlike voice character. I'm not gonna say names because I don't know, I'm not gonna spoil stuff. I think that this character is pretty well written, and the overall theme of the game of you kind of educating the voice and teaching it through your actions of what their moral compass should be, what is ethical and what isn't, what is right and what is wrong, is really well done, and it is exciting and kept me second guessing on my conversations with the voice and on some of the decisions I took throughout the game, and it does turn out that a lot of those do matter in your interactions with the voice towards the end of it. But everything else, from the tense relationship of the Empire and the locals, and your 4 companions, it's not very good. There are strokes of compelling storylines here. Kai, your blue friend, voiced by the same actor as Garrus in Mass Effect, has some interesting history tied to him in the world, but he's very one-note. Marius can be a confusing mess, switching between eagerly helpful like a little puppy and a shut-down loner that feels like a badly written tsundere. Giada is the most interesting of the bunch, given her connection to animancy and the general plot developments around her, and Yatsley is a character that you will either love or hate, or in my case, love and hate, depending on the situation and how she reacts to it. But she's loud and brazen, and she does what she's meant to do, I guess, so there you go. But none of their stories really hit home or try and center in on an emotional core that gets you invested in a progression of their character or on solutions that you can really offer for them. It's like they're trying to hint at great emotional depth, but then they come off as people that are willing to do anything as long as they're with you. And they smile at whatever you do, even when you do things that actively harm them or that they strongly disapprove of. Your relationship stays the same. They continue to smile and they have your back and they expect you to have theirs, even if you met them 20 minutes ago. And there's attempts with all 4 companions to kind of create a connection with them based on previous existing wounds that they have. Unresolved trauma, and you as the envoy helping them resolve it in some way. But it's never a direct resolution. There is no real action happening here. Instead, it's more that they will open up and talk about that trauma, and then things that remind them of that trauma or are tangentially related will happen, and then you will have a conversation where they come to terms with it, and it kind of feels a bit like, in the end, Avowed was the friends we made along the way. Now, some people might hear that and say, that's cool, because that's kind of like a more realistic way of actually resolving trauma through conversation and triggering some of that trauma in a way or something like that. But I'm here to say that I absolutely hate this, and I like it more when things are really tied into the game and the gameplay experience and the narrative of what you are doing, instead of just kind of being these side activities that lead to conversations at camp. So to put it a different way, I think that Baldur's Gate 3 is the game that has the best written companions of any RPG I've played, primarily because the way that their stories are weaved into the main story. It's a brilliant way of keeping the entire pacing up while upping the stakes and making your relationship with those companions matter more and more. But even if we take Baldur's Gate 3 off the table, the companions in Avowed have a worse structured and less impactful story than pretty much any companion in Mass Effect 2, which is a game that I would say does a better job despite not really being excellent at it, so there you go. One of the best ways to really explain this is that there is a dialogue line for Kai during combat, and it's, I believe, tied to when you help him up after his health depletes, but I had it triggered constantly, so I'm guessing it's also tied to the second wind ability he has, and he will say, "You're a good friend." And I think it's meant to tie in with his questline and his feelings of being a bad friend and a traitor. But even after that context for Kai is revealed, that line just feels like this throwaway thing that was placed there because Kai is meant to be a nice guy. And he would be the type of dude to yell randomly in combat, "You're a good friend." Oh goody. Now, moving on from companions, most of the decisions in Avowed follow the same basic structure as The Outer Worlds, which is choosing between 2 bad things. What do you think is less worse? There is a bit more subtlety to it here than in some other games by Obsidian in the past. It isn't quite, do you want to live like slaves but be safe, or do you want to be free but the floor is permanently lava? But it does follow the same philosophy that you will always piss someone off. Even when choosing the most obviously righteous and correct path, people will end up suffering. It's a game where being good can sometimes cause a lot of bad things to happen, and what might seem like being bad or playing the villain on the front of the tin is actually the best possible mercy given the circumstances. And if you have to pick a lane in RPG writing, I think this is a safe lane to pick. But it has the same exact annoying problem of not presenting you with impossibly difficult hidden options to get a completely good or bad outcome. For me, a large part of becoming invested in an RPG is understanding the situation, understanding that there's no right answer available, and then going to extreme lengths to create one. Those situations where if you spend enough time going out of your way to find additional comments, characters, books, items, and then you have just the right combination of speech checks, you open up the magic path that solves the ordeal and rewards your extreme investment. Those are the sorts of things that make me love an RPG, and it's because the game's reactivity, the ability it has to reward you for the unexpected, is what makes me want to dive in and fully explore everything and get invested into every conversation and write down every detail as I hunt for the best possible solutions for the character I've made up in my mind. And Avowed doesn't have that. So I guess the final problem to mention here is that even in a lot of these situations where you have to pick between the lesser of two evils, you probably won't care too much because you really don't have a reason to care for a lot of the characters and people and cities and just overall things in the game, honestly. And that's because overall, Avowed's reactivity and its commitment to immersion is almost non-existent. I've seen viral clips trying to dunk on Avowed, showing how if you use a fire spell on grass, that won't set it ablaze, which is something you can do in Skyrim. Or heck, if they really wanted to talk about old games, they could have shown Far Cry 2. I've seen people mention that you can't kill the wildlife and skin them for meat or something in the game. They're just these moving things that you can't interact with in the wild. And I think these comparisons are meant to say video games are actually regressing. But in reality, it's just a design choice around immersion and what the game prioritizes in its design. Avowed is very controlled. Its puzzles are static. It's not meant to be solved through creativity and immersion systems, but instead by choosing from the available options are often the only option there. If you are meant to interact with the environment in some way, like for example, you can use elemental magic or weapons to burn down paths, or create ice platforms on water, or use electricity to power different mechanical devices. But if you really need to do that, you'll find a grenade close by to use for that scenario because the game is too afraid that you reach that location, you reach that point, without equipment to do that for your own. So yeah, the grass doesn't burn, but I don't consider that to be an oversight as much as it's not part of the design. They didn't want that sort of emergent system to be usable in creating danger for the player and creating, a damage source for the enemies. They wanted things to be controlled, and in my book, that's fine. Now, what isn't fine is when you take this same idea of reactivity and immersion and then you apply it to the entire world and not just the environment. So here's a quick, simple, and very damning thing to notice. If a character speaks in Avowed, they are a quest giver or interactable. Otherwise, they will never speak. Sorry, I just rechecked my footage. I have 2 different occasions where characters are speaking and you can interact with them, but they are also outside of the bounds of the map, so you're not meant to interact with them. I guess it's kind of like a theater performance at that point. Anyways, in 99% of cases, if you hear a voice, you're meant to head towards it and interact with it. If you're running across the busy streets of a city, there is complete silence. There is no ambient chatter, no voice lines from the townsfolk, no comments from people on recent life-changing events, nobody is arguing about what's going on, and if someone says something and the subtitles appear on screen, it's because you should talk to them. Avowed in this way feels like a single-player MMO. Characters and events exist for you to discover them, not because they were there before and will be after. You can't talk to random people and just ask questions, which in my opinion is a really fun thing to do in RPGs when you don't know if any conversation can trigger a questline, but not here. No, the questlines are very clearly signposted to you. Please don't try and talk to other people. When you combine this overall feeling of the world and how your companions act and just how strange a lot of the pivotal moments of the game appear, they're kind of just frozen in time waiting for you to arrive. It turns the beautiful places you see and the rich lore and history that Eora has as a universe already existing in the Pillars of Eternity franchise, and somehow ends up with Westworld. You will walk around town in complete silence until the subtitles pop up on screen and you hear from far away, "Oh no! How am I going to solve this problem? Who is going to deliver this letter for me?" And you will slowly roll your eyes at that. This is where the biggest pain point for me comes in, and that's that the entire game just doesn't feel cohesive. There are moments in this game where you can engage in conversations that will take up to 10 minutes. There are moments where you'll encounter a room with enough books to spend 15 minutes reading through lore and backstory. But as a world it feels dead, and as an RPG it feels rote, and somehow it still insists that it is one. I think Avowed would have been better if it focused more on being an action game instead of pretending to be something that it isn't, because those moments and seams in the tapestry distract and break up the adventurous pacing that the game has, as if the problems in its gear and difficulty weren't enough to begin with. Which is why this has honestly been the most difficult review for me to do, to really put my thoughts to paper. The combat, movement, and exploration, which are often the weakest parts of these sorts of games, are actually good here. It's not just because the overall standards we have for the genre are so low, it's that Avowed does a really good job at it when directly comparing it to some other melee-based action games. The moments that you have in the game where you're just running around, exploring, looking at the world, and trying to scout out a path to reach a secret can be so much fun, and some of the fights that ensue can be awesome when they aren't frustrating. And all of that together, when you combine the rewarding exploration and the fun combat, made me want to play through the whole game, but it did have me daydreaming of a world where a bigger, broader in scope game takes these elements and applies them. An Elder Scrolls 6 that has this quality of combat, movement, and unique and wonderful areas to explore is just an amazing thought. It's the sort of stuff dreams are made of, where you fantasize about your favorite perfect game. But it would only matter if it's coupled with the reactive, breathing world that I want in an RPG, including all of the options that Avowed just kind of doesn't have. Things from stealth to a lot of the expected, more creative solutions that you could find for things, or just trying to circumvent stuff, or interacting with the game in ways that are the typical, well, how about I just don't talk to you and instead I kill you right now? And because Avowed is missing so much of that, but it still tries to create what feels like a facsimile of a world where you should be able to cut down NPCs, where you should be able to decide that, hey, I don't want to do this, so I'm just going to turn around and leave and do something different, but you can't. That's where all of the frustration comes in. And for as good as it is as a stepping stone of its combat and the exploration that it puts forwards, it's the friction with the world that it has that makes it all just a bit uncanny and never finished sitting right with me. And to really drive this point home, I need to talk about some of the endgame stuff. So, minor spoilers, I'm not gonna ruin anything, but I do need to talk about the final area in the game to really show you what I'm talking about. Now, towards the very end of the game, you have some highlights and you have some really drawn out fights and a lot of questing, because the last, I would say, quarter of the game really starts to drag. And I think it's all because there is a very sour taste that is left in the player's mouth once you make a very important decision a little bit after halfway through. You have to decide between a solution that will help people right now but doom them in the future, or sacrificing a lot of people in order to guarantee a future. And if you make that decision, which was my case, a lot of people are dead. And when you return to town where all of these people are dead, there really isn't anything to showcase that. Everything just kind of feels the same, except that now when you start a dialogue with a character, they scream at you, but nobody else really cares. Such a pivotal, big, important story decision just not having any real consequences is just jarring. But then you continue on to what's going to feel a lot better in the last quarter of the game, where a similar story unfolds in a different fourth city in the game, and that one does have a bit more of an appropriate reaction. And then you just wonder what happened, what was wrong here, what did you guys do, why something's good, why some bad, what's this? And finally, you reach the 5th area of the game, which is not an open world area like the rest of them. It doesn't have a city and side quests and bounties and all of the things you've come to expect, and instead, it's more of a straight line with some additional areas that you can explore that kind of connect back. There's a little bit of Dark Souls level design in this final area, but here the game is all combat. Because you don't have the exploration elements, the platforming, the looking around for different things, those are also condensed into this other level design format that isn't the pseudo-open world. The flaws in the combat become much more apparent because now you're doing it just so much. You're fighting for what feels like maybe 2 to 3 hours. Depending on your build and how efficient you are, some of these enemies will just take a ton of punishment, and you are at endgame. The game is giving you gear that is appropriate for this, and still the numbers are so high that it takes so long to kill these enemies, and many of them can one-shot you. And what is there to break up the monotony of the endgame combat? Well, you resolve the different quest lines of your 4 companions in this zone, with very long, extended conversations with them, sometimes very poorly written because they'll just pop up and say, "In reality, I never told you this, but I've always had this problem and this is the solution to it. Isn't that crazy?" So you're breaking up 25 minutes of fighting with 15 minutes of conversations with characters that you don't care about, and that's where you realize that Avowed's combat system cannot sustain it as an action game, and that its world is not good enough to even break up the pace of an action game. It really depends on that third element of the pseudo-open world to kind of tie everything together. Now, at least the final decisions that you make in the game did feel meaningful to me. They all have these parallels with some of the decisions you've made throughout the game, and your conversations with the final NPC are a mirror of what you've become throughout it. And depending on those things, you have quite a lot of different options. I did some reloads of saves and stuff, and I checked the wiki to see just how many endings there are, and there are a lot. The game does take that stuff into account. But how valuable is it if it's only really at the end of it all? Now, I think that the payoff was pretty cool, but it wasn't worth all of the buildup, if that makes any sense. There was so much going on with your companions and with some of the towns and some of the people just to kind of have it be thrown away at the end. There is an attempt to unify everything in a final, big, grandiose set piece that falls completely flat because it's combat reliant, and at this point you're probably sick and tired of the combat and just want the game to be over. But it's this awkward pacing of spending all of this time just fighting and moving in a straight line and then talking for so long about things that you don't really care about. And there are some interesting little parallels that I found with something like Fallout New Vegas and Caesar's Legion here, and it just put into perspective how poorly done some of the stuff in Avowed is when it comes to making you care about the characters compared to other games that Obsidian has put out. And still, somehow, the game is good enough when it does have its pacing a bit better, when it does use the pseudo-open world, and when you are pushed to explore and progress and find new gear and find cool stuff, fight things, and just kind of have a little bit of the things that the game does sprinkled about with just the right amount of combat at the center. When it does that, it can be fun, it can be satisfying, and it can keep you tugging along, but just in a good way, not in a junk food kind of way. It's not like it's decent. It's like, I'm invested, I'm having fun, I want to play a little bit more of Avowed. And then it will constantly disappoint you with breaks in that pacing that make you frustrated. And in the end, the only thing I came to say was Avowed is fine. And that's okay. It really is just a fine game. It's not fine in the sense that everything that it does is mediocre. It's just that it has some stuff that's pretty good, and it has some stuff that's downright terrible. Some of it is just frustrating, and some of it can be circumvented. So at the end of the day, the mishmash of all of these things is fine. It's much better than if the game were just mid, because if the game were mediocre across the board, there would be no reason to play it, at least because it has those bright spots. The people who want those are going to have a good experience with it. But that doesn't stop the overall feeling once you're done with it being that of a game that has many, many low points. Now, if this is going to be a stepping stone to better incorporating the dream RPG that has actually good combat and exploration and movement, but the excellently written story and the world that we've come to expect with the reactivity that we expect from these sorts of games, then I wholeheartedly accept it as that stepping stone and I applaud it. But that doesn't mean that I recommend it. I think that if you've reached this point in the video, you've got a pretty good idea of if you're going to enjoy your time with Avowed or not, but I specifically want to say that it has to do with Game Pass. If you have Game Pass, feel free to jump in. But I don't think that this game is worth the full price of admission. Sure, it's a long game at around 40 hours, but there's a lot of those 40 hours that are frustration. So I would wait for a sale and maybe some patches to balance out some of the combat pacing and the difficulty around it. And there, I think you could have a good time if you know what you're getting yourself into. In a world where video games need to be better than good enough, Avowed manages to do some things that are better than good enough. And that does mean that it can be worth someone's time. But that doesn't mean it's a great game, because I don't think it is. This to me is a new definition of a game that's fine. This is the new 7 out of 10, and unfortunately I expected more from Obsidian, but I'm still gonna hold out hope since they seem to be making so many games over there despite the limited staff. So let's hope they learn from the mistakes that are present here. I've been Mug, thank you so much for watching. I hope that this was an enjoyable time, just kind of talking about Avowed, because interesting game. That's for sure. A very special shout out to my patrons up on the $1 patron wall who support everything that I do here on the channel and very often allow me to do stuff like upgrade the equipment that I use and stuff like that. So huge shout out to them. And if you're interested in supporting the channel directly, you can see the link in the description below. This video's sponsor, boot.dev, which I want to give a shout out to here at the end. I don't have to, but they really have been supporting the channel for very long. If you want more from me, remember to subscribe, and if not, go out there, enjoy some great games, and I'll see you again very soon.